Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiMitzvahs22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I'm very happy to be back behind the microphone. It's been about a week or maybe even a little bit more since my last interview. Things are heating up here on the farm. Spring is a busy time on the farm. So that's the problem. And then I've also had a lot of writing projects I've been involved in. And our fundraiser is still going on. It's winding down, but we're going to be building a hermitage on the property. For those of you who know what a Pustinia hermitage is, related to Catherine Doherty and Madonna House, we're going to be building one of those if we get enough money here. We've already gotten a few generous donations, but a few more would make it an even nicer Pustini hermitage. And so please send your nickels. But some of you have been very generous. So all joking aside, anyway, I'm excited today to have a repeat customer, as I like to say, repeat victim of the blog of the podcast. Father Elias Carr is with us once again, so we could call this Father Carr Part Deux. Welcome, Father Elias Carr.
Thank you, Larry, very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
And for those of you who do remember, Father Carr is an expert on the thought of Rene Girard. And I think Rene Girard is a very, very important thinker and intellectual. And so we're going to be discussing Father's book that came out last year, I Came to Cast Fire, an introduction to Rene Girard. I Came to Cast Fire, an introduction to Rene Girard. We got through quite a bit of the book during our first podcast, but there was a lot left on the floor that we didn't get to. So we're going to get to some more of those aspects of the book and then possibly even move on to a discussion of how all of it relates to an article I just had published in Catholic World Report on the nature of salvation. But anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Father Carr. We were talking sort of off camera about an issue with Gerard that you wanted to bring up. So go ahead.
It's certainly been one of my experiences of late with meeting people talking about the book, that there is an important sector of the church that doesn't quite know what to do with Rene Girard and his writings, and that would be Thomists. They seem to often feel very put off by Girard. Oftentimes, they've had a very superficial encounter, maybe with one of his earlier texts, and because his approach, his starting point is not metaphysical, is not systematic, is not philosophical. They often don't really find how they can engage Gerard in a positive way, and I think
Yeah.
that's really important for the future. That these two bodies of knowledge not be seen in any way in a competition or mimetic rivalry, but rather put it in
Yeah.
those terms, but to see that it can be quite constructive. They're approaching the many questions from a very different angle, but they're quite complementary. And I think that would be the point, that we need to have people who are experts in Thomas also who are interested in maybe working on this
Yeah.
to to approach this question with
Okay,
those of
but
us who are enthusiastic for Girard.
let's get into that. But before we do, I neglected to give Father Carr's biography here, or at least what it's on the back of the book. So I should mention this. Father Carr is a canon regular of Saint Augustine of Stift Klosterneuburg, Austria. He co-founded the canonry of Saint Leopold in 2011 in Glen Cove, New York, and now serves as the Kämmerer of Klosterneuburg. He is also the pastor of the parish of Wiedling. He defended his dissertation on the life and early works of Raymond Schwager, S.J., a friend and collaborator. Is it Schwager or Schwager?
Schwager,
Schwager. Yeah, there's no umlaut, so
exactly.
Schwager, S.J., a friend and collaborator of Rene Girard, and at the John Paul II Pontifical University in Krakow, Poland, in June of 2022. So that is who Father Carr is, for those of you who may have forgotten from the last thing. Okay, so Thomas have an issue with Girard. Well, surprise, surprise. Thomas often have an issue with a. I'm a Balthasarian. They have issues with Balthasar. They have issues with anybody apparently that isn't Thomas. I joke, I jest.
Oh,
I like Thomas, of course. Who doesn't like Thomas Aquinas?
right.
But anyway, I guess some don't, but I like him. At any rate, so why don't the Thomists like Girard, Or not maybe what sorts of problems? Let's put it that.
I think it really comes with the beginning points. So Thomas scholasticism is a philosophical system that's trying to find true statements in all times and places. So it's metaphysically based, uh, and it's very comfortable with that sort of line of building premises and arguments based on these premises, and it achieves great insight. But it I don't really know how it deals with history. And I think that's its fundamental challenge. And I'm sure there are great Thomists who've come up with good answers already. But I think that's really at the heart of it is a metaphysical system which is trying to be true in all times and places, often finds it difficult to deal with change and and how one can deal with it. And of course Girard is coming out of that natural science tradition. That's the one he wants to be working in, which especially coming out of the 19th century, is deeply imbued with a sense of historical consciousness, whether it
Yeah.
be Darwin and evolutionary thinking or the historical sciences as such. And the application more and more of this idea of a history of a scientific discipline has even continues to this day to render all sorts of new important insights. For instance, just a completely bizarre thing, the history of minerals on Earth. The Earth is one of the most interesting places in the universe because of the co-evolution of life
Yeah.
and minerals. And as a result, we have lots more interesting things going on this planet because of this process, which wouldn't exist in other places because of the absence of life, for instance.
Yeah. So there is, I mean, that is a sort of, I think, common objection to the Thomistic system that is as wonderful as it is, as rigorous and systematic as it is, and it is, there is a problem with historicity. It tend to just want to float above history. Now, let me play devil's advocate here, Father, before we dive
Please, no, no,
into
we want to be
Girard. Uh,
entirely
I think speaking as a pretend Thomist here, I'll say, but Father, there are some truths that transcend history. And certainly the Catholic faith has truths that transcend history. So what's wrong with having a system that has that as its focus?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's wonderful that we have it. But the point is we need more tools in the toolbox. And if we look at the great scholastic synthesis of the Middle Ages, the scholastic humanism, which is an extremely optimistic project about what could be accomplished in terms of what human beings could know and how it could be translated to practical application through canon law and the creation of Europe, it did create something tremendous, but it was not able to address issues like war, commerce, trade, property. It had difficulties with these things, and naturally, that's how you get the late scholasticism with nominalism and so forth. So it's of course something we want to use. It's the language of the magisterium. When we look at the technical passages in Vatican II, for instance,
Yeah,
Lumen 25, it's clear that we're using scholastic language. But at the same time, uh, it needs other we need other tools in the box, and I
yeah, I
think
agree.
what Girard is. I and of course, and Girard and von Balthasar are coming from a very similar perspective because von Balthasar suffered under the 19th century, early 20th century neo-scholastic synthesis. He found it death. And where did he look for his theology? In literature. And that's where Girard's insight comes from. So they had this parallel where they both see that literary criticism is an alternative source of truth to the natural sciences or philosophy. Sometimes the natural science and philosophy cannot discover these things or is not able to, but literature is. And so literary criticism becomes an important way of also a source for theology.
Absolutely. It's no accident why Balthazar started his trilogy with the aesthetic. It's all about the beautiful and then the good and the true. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't think the fact that the true comes third in the trilogy means that it is of third level importance.
Oh, no, no,
I
not at
I
all.
just think though that what Balthazar thought was, okay, we've had many centuries of focusing on the true and then trying to derive in some sense the good from that.
But
But we've had precious little focus on the art,
Mhm.
beauty, the literary, the musical, the dramatic, all
Exactly.
of those things as actually a source of universal human truth.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And you look at Joseph Ratzinger, for example. Joseph Ratzinger wanted to do a theology of history. So
Exactly.
he had to turn to St. Bonaventure in
Hmm.
the medieval world to find a theology of history because he could not and did not find it in Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
Aquinas does not give us a theology of history. He just doesn't.
No, no, and that's it. That is and was the pressing issue of the time, that the neo-scholastic synthesis, which then of course breaks down into all these different Thomistic directions in the 20th century, all these different schools, trying to figure out how to deal with these things. It couldn't handle these things. And we see why, why all those, the ressourcement, all these, the ad fontes movements in the Bible and patristics and liturgy and ecumenical studies, all of these things culminate in the Second Vatican Council, and in the documents of the Second Vatican Council as an enriching of the toolbox.
Yes, I like how you keep coming back to that metaphor that is a toolbox,
Yeah.
and the reason why I like that metaphor or that comparison, excuse me, I'm for some reason have a tickle in my throat. I hope that doesn't bother me too much during this thing,
Oh,
but but anyway, yeah, the reason why I like that is because precisely one of the problems that I have always had with Thomists in general and with
yes.
scholasticism isn't so much the truth that they have in them. And there's a lot there. Oh my goodness. You could spend your entire life diving into Thomas Aquinas, as Thomists, in fact, do, as I do with Balthasar. That's so it's not the point. Is he profound? The point is that he is so often treated as the sole and only arbiter of what counts as a tool in our theology. There's one tool in our theological
Right,
toolbox,
right.
and it comes from Aquinas.
And
Or
the
let's put it this way:
Yeah,
we can have a toolbox with multiple tools, but they're all Thomistic tools. It's
right,
like you went and you get a Sears Craftsman ratchet set, and it's all great. There's a lot of stuff there, but it's all a Craftsman ratchet
right,
set,
exactly.
right? And we need other ratchet sets to come into the toolbox. Now I'm pushing the metaphor too far, but you get the point.
I do, and of course, and it's not even all of Thomas we're often getting. I mean, Thomas,
Mm,
one right, the hymn writer, who writes these beautiful, beautiful Eucharistic hymns that we still sing to this day, and Thomas, the scripture commentator. But those get less attention. It's really about the Summa Theologica, which, is it that genre of that time period, and especially with the reintroduction of Aristotelian thought into Europe and the Aristotelian logic. And Aristotle, of course, is an amazing scholar. What we have of him, very rigorous, but even Aristotle admits that, in the two ways of knowledge, the way of science is a way that's restricted to very few, because very few people have the intelligence and the time and the freedom to do that. Most depend on the way of rhetoric. And that means people have to be entrusted not only to master those arguments and then be able to communicate them, but they must also live them. And they must also
yes.
live those by example so that their message can be trusted by everybody else as being equivalent to a scientific truth. And I think that's where it's so important that we look for as many tools as possible, because a lot of people need that. Most people need that, and that's what theologians and people who are interested in theology need to really strive to be.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I'm reminded as you were speaking, there's a famous essay written by von Balthasar. It's in Communio. You can go look it up. I don't have the top of my head what issue. It's called The Fathers, the Scholastics, and Ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And what he does, he engages in a kind of periodization of
Right.
theological history. And he points out what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of the major eras. And the
Right.
patristic era has its strengths and its weaknesses.
Absolutely.
Medieval era, the scholastics, strengths and weaknesses. And then then there's us, and what is, and the modern world, whenever that begins. And he says it has tremendous weaknesses, but it does have strengths. Okay, the point I'm leading up to here is it goes back to this thing you were talking about with regard to Girard and Balthasar both discovered truth in the literary and the artistic. Balthasar makes a big deal about the fact that there was a shift. There was a shift from theology in the patristic era of being grounded primarily in a monastic setting.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And then it shifts in the medieval world with the introduction of Aristotle into a university setting.
Mhm.
And he goes, with that shift from monastery to university came a greater precision, a less lyrical, less poetic,
Mhm.
less artistically oriented theology, less mystical theology. And instead, we get a more systematic, rigorous, sort of philosophical theology, metaphysical theology. And Butler goes, that is great. But it also came at a cost. And the cost was not with Aquinas or Bonaventure, but with their epigons, with who came later, a rupture between spirituality and theology. It's all. He also talks about this in his essay, Theology and Sanctity. I'll shut up here in a second. People always complain, "Hey, you talk too much. Let your guest speak." So I'm going to do that, but I want to just I'm going through all this, and I know you know it all, but so the viewers and listeners
Absolutely.
understand, I'm trying to set up then this is what Girard and Balthazar together are saying when they say we
Right.
need to recover other propaedeutics, other
Right.
ways of introducing revelation other than just the deductive
Exactly.
method of the scholastics.
Exactly. And it's not to say that that's still there. It's just saying we need other ones because people are different and they have different and God needs to reach everybody. So we should look at all the different ways we can do this. Uh, this very theme, of course, is in the formation of Riemann Schwager, his novice master, wrote an anthology about the theology of the Sacred Heart, which is interesting because of what Pope Francis did with that last year. But this issue is right there in the whole question of the Sacred Heart theology, spirituality. How do you put the rational and the affective back together? And this is also, interestingly, for Schwager, the source of his term dramatic in dramatic theology, which is a line he takes from the very peculiar French literary figures of Roland Barthes and Georges Bataille. And they speak about Ignatius of Loyola of bringing the affective and the rational and volitional together in
Yes.
drama. And that, so you see, it's all in the air at that time period. There's everybody's feeling there's this division. It's not healthy. How do we bring it back together?
Is it? And by the way, yes, it's Ramen Schwager. I think when I introduced him, am I need my bifocals adjusted. I'm reading this. I said Raymond, but it is
German,
Raymund.
Raimund,
Yes,
but
yeah, Raimund.
yeah.
Raymund. Raimund Schwager, S.J. Is there anything in English published by him that viewers and listeners could access?
His later books are published. Must We Have Scapegoats, which was his first uh, really protracted engagement with Girard in the 1970s, and then taking it in a biblical direction. And then of course, his more mature presentation of dramatic theology, which is Jesus in the Drama of Salvation, and the companion book he wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, which was a novella. So illustrating, like telling the biblical story with the insights of mimetic theory in a novel form. In other
Oh,
words, for
that's
normal
so.
people.
So, is it a retelling of the life of Jesus?
Yes.
Is it any good?
No, it's good because he says right up front that I take it for granted that the Bible is inspired, that Jesus is the dogmatic center of the Bible. To read the Bible correctly means you have to read it through him. So, and then at the same time, he's trying to describe the story, especially of the passion and resurrection through his dramatic theology, which
Oh,
is the
I got a hip. I must get this.
yeah, no, this is the it's published by the Herder version in English, whatever it, Crossroads or something like that. But it's
Okay, very good.
available, and Schwager is really important because he's the one who really helps Girard clearly move his language and his expressions in a Orthodox Catholic manner, which he doesn't always do at the beginning because he's not aware he's not doing it. He doesn't know.
I'm so glad we're having this second conversation because I obviously don't know very much about Raimund Schwager at all. I just know the few things I've read by
Mhm.
Girard. So it is good to get this background that
Yeah.
that it was Schwager who deeply influenced Girard and probably a little bit vice versa then.
Oh, no, no, absolutely. They
Yeah.
mutually influence each other. A very good collaborative relationship of two people with different sets of talents. But because of God's providence, Girard was the right man in the right place to be able to recognize what Girard was doing was important and could talk to him in a constructive manner and didn't dismiss him. And they would have been about maybe 15 years apart in age, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And but because Schwager studied in Fauvier in Lyon, he was fluent in
Oh.
French.
Oh, okay. Great.
So he was able to read Girard's Violence in the Sacred and the review of it right when it came out. So he's engaged with him right at that point when he's becoming famous. And later in life, he said to one of his colleagues at Innsbruck, Es war schon in mir. It was already in me. And
It was
that's
in it
what
was
my
in him.
doctorate really was about.
Fouvier, yeah, Fouvier got started because of the Kulturkampf, didn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, when Bismarck kicked all the jebbies out.
But and also in France, you have all these things, all of the educational institutions where Schwager studied from like high school to Fribourg in Switzerland were all these institutions that had suffered in one way or another from the 19th century Kulturkämpfe against the Catholic Church or between
Yeah,
liberals and the church. So it's so interesting thinking about these kinds of places where theology happens. Like you were talking about going the transition from monastic centers to universities. I think it would be great to write a book or have a TV series about the topography of theology and to choose one of these
wow.
places over each century as emblematic to really make us think about these human contexts where theology is done. Because I think it just
Yeah. It's just, it's fascinating to me. And I know we're kind of meandering a little bit off topic, but
yeah,
in some ways it's not. To go along with the idea that there are literary avenues to truth, artistic avenues to truth, uh, Goethe rather than Kant,
absolutely.
to put it,
Absolutely.
there's also, I love reading the memoirs now of thinkers that were very, very influential in my life. And I just approach them as intellectuals. Oh
Right,
my gosh, I love Joseph Pieper. Oh,
right.
I like Yves Congar, even though I have certain issues
Sure.
with the late Congar, who became a little more liberal, whatever. So, and I love Louis Bouillet. And so, but then I realized, oh, they sort of all wrote intellectual autobiographies,
Mhm.
memoirs. You go and read those, and all of a sudden, their lives come alive.
Absolutely.
You realize these were real people
Yeah,
locked in real debates at
that's right.
real schools that have a real, I like your language, Father.
Yeah,
There's a real topography, in
yeah,
other words, there.
yeah. And that was the approach I took when I was describing Schwager's upbringing and his education, and then his pre-Innsbruck life, which is what was the subject. To me, that's not only useful to study him, but it's useful to study any theologian because then you understand why do they worry about this and not that? Well, there were probably very concrete sociological, historical reasons. We don't even enter into psychological because I don't have any access to that, but I can know something about where he studied, who his classmates were, all, what were they taught, who were the teachers, what were the concerns going on in the day, where was what was going on with the church, and suddenly you say this makes sense now. This
Yeah.
is and that's the one thing one can say good about historical critical biblical studies. Jesus is no longer walking on a dusty road in a weird landscape that's kind of a fantasy. We have such good understanding more than anybody else probably in the human race of because of archaeology and ongoing discoveries, the real historical concrete circumstances of the Holy Land in the first century. And it is so much more interesting as a result.
Yeah.
The rediscovery of the Roman context, for instance, in the 1970s, 80s, has transformed certainly my understanding of all these things, let alone the Jewish, obviously, and the Greek. But now you have this vast, really enriched environment to see this is where he lived. He's engaged in the same issues you and I are engaging in our everyday lives.
Yeah. I've had similar, I've never been to the Holy Land, But it's one of the reasons why I love Rome is I never get tired of going to the tomb of Saint Peter, going to the tomb of Saint Paul or some of the other tombs, and I realize these were real people.
Mhm.
They really lived.
Yep.
And just outside of St. Peter's is where St. Peter really was crucified upside down, where the
Mhm.
obelisk is there. And so these were real people. And so yeah, but let's come back to it, Raymond Schwager, because this is fast. So when was he born and when did he die?
He was born in 1938 on November 11th, which itself is a highly symbolic day. It is the feast of Saint Martin and also the armistice of World War One.
Yes.
So highly symbolic day. And then he died in 2004. So he died very young.
Okay. So he was not really old enough to have experienced the horrors of Nazi Germany
No, no, and
growing
he
up.
was born in Switzerland. So
Oh,
he
okay.
lived
Die
through the
Schweiz.
dislocation of the war as Switzerland experienced it, but he did not live in Germany. He was Swiss, but he's very clear in his own reflections that being Swiss, he was from Thurgau. Thurgau was a Swiss canton that for several hundred years was a colony of the core Swiss cantons. In German, they're Gemeindeherrschaften. They were like
Yeah.
condominium. And when he would hear in the school the Swiss were freedom-loving people, he said, "Yeah, except for us, we were under your submission." Only after the French Revolution is then are these cantons lifted up on the same level. So he
Ah,
says, for him, this is when he learned to suspect myth, when he learned to doubt these myths that were being told because it was not true. His experience contradicted it. And for me, this was part of my methodology for looking at him. I saw in him these three myths, these three marginalities that helped him be acute to these things. That is, he was a Catholic in a Protestant majority country, even if by the time he was growing up, Catholics had attained more or less a parity. He was a Jesuit, and the anti-Jesuitism plays a fundamental role in the formation of the the modern Swiss state, including the Civil War in 1847 and then the Kulturkampf. The
yeah.
Jesuits were, of course, constitutionally illegal until 1972 or 73.
Really that late?
That late. And interestingly enough, the Jesuit question is very tied closely to the women's question in Switzerland, because the women got the right to vote and participate in public office only about a year or two earlier. This has to do all with the whole sort of 19th century milieu in um, Bildungskultur, the German upper middle class Protestant understanding of what proper roles between men and women, education, modern state, administration, economy, and how Catholics were completely unqualified for this. This is a really interesting discourse at that time because there it's a religious discourse. In the United States, it would be a race discourse between white people, black people, whatever.
Well, gosh, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
I love it when I have a guest on and I'm just blown away by the fact that I'm completely ignorant on a topic and I'm being taken to school and in a good way, in a good way.
Yeah.
Uh, I didn't know Schwager was Swiss.
No.
And that's, I mean, Balthasar was Swiss. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, that,
They were both Jesuits. Of
yeah, and they
course,
were both Jesuits. So
with
that's what was
Balthasar
going through
left.
my mind when you said there were all these anti-Jesuit laws. And I'm going, oh, geez.
What's interesting though is, of course, because Switzerland was a confederal state, the Catholic cantons basically ignored this rule. And as long as the Jesuits were forbidden to be teachers and pastors or work in the university, they carried on. The Swiss police, I've read reports, knew that there were this many Jesuits here, this many Jesuits there, including von Balthasar before he left the Jesuits. That might have even been one of the motivating reasons to leave the Jesuits, because then he would be, although he never held a university position, but he would not be under that provision anymore.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and so it's really fascinating because this weird ambivalent state of being, a state enemy, uh, for a country that's conceiving itself as a liberal democracy, begins to become a real tension in the 50s, but they don't know how to really resolve it. And the Jesuits, for their side, said, we want to resolve this popularly. We don't want we want there to be a clear desire on the part of the people of Switzerland to end this. We don't want it imposed from the top, so to speak. So the whole campaign to change the amendment is part of Schwager's experience as a young Jesuit who's finished his studies in Fribourg, and he's part of the campaign. It's the same time when the Swiss Synod is going on to some extent.
Very interesting.
So these things are really interesting and intertwined.
So, what role did this play in his sort of is developing of these same insights that Girard has about the scapegoat mechanism?
I think because, of course, the Jesuits were scapegoated
Right.
in Swiss political history. They had still this ambivalent place. Thurgau and the other Gemeindeherrschaften had been marginalized, and in a sense, their histories were not taken seriously as a counter narrative to the Swiss narrative of freedom. William Tell killing the Habsburgs and driving out Habsburg tyranny, and now we have an opera and everything like that. All these things are really important actually, because the Swiss myth of freedom will eventually be reworked after the Kulturkampf, especially in the 1920s and 30s, to include Catholics, because they're now trying to protect Switzerland from extremes on both ends of the political spectrum. Um, so then there's a chance to redefine this so that these people can now be in the story as well. They're not on the outside. So the
Yeah.
the cantons, the Catholics, and only then later will the Jesuits have this legal recognition finally, or this legal restriction removed. So I think Schwager, it's very easy to see he had these multiple experiences through these meta narratives or narratives in which he's participating, as from Thurgau, as a Catholic, and as a Jesuit, um, that he's very sensitive to these issues. And his two earliest writings, which he wrote when he was still in university, are extremely interesting, with incredible insight about these kinds of mechanisms that are going on. These are, say, from 1969 and 70, or right around there. And the second one is an incredibly interesting one about the papacy, um, where he has some, because this is post Humana Vitae,
Right.
and in the view of Paul VI as he's either enemy or friend, and how the papacy has caused for a lot of people the scandal. He didn't change the teachings. We don't like him. He's terrible. And so just the importance of the papacy in terms of its ability to be either Peter or Satan. And this is the first place I ever read this exegesis of Matthew 16, but he basically makes the argument, maybe you've heard this before, that when Simon, Simon, you are Simon, and you
Yeah.
are Bar-Yona, and upon this rock I will build my church. And why is that? Because God gave it to him. God gave him this. It was a gift. It wasn't because Simon was better than anybody else. But then, of course, when Jesus reveals that it's going to lead to the passion, that he's this course, he takes him aside and says, this won't be. And he said, "Get behind me, Satan. You think as men do, and not as God does." And so we see that when Simon thinks as God does, he's Peter, and when he thinks as men do, he's Satan, because it becomes the great scandal for the
And
whole church.
notice what the neuralgic point was, the cross.
Yeah,
The
exactly,
cross,
exactly.
which is,
Right,
as
right.
I read Matthew 16, what has always struck me was, when are the popes at their greatest in the history of the Catholic Church? Meaning, when are they fulfilling God's will and doing what God? It's when they're pursuing the way of the cross.
And we
And
see,
when are popes the worst is when they're turning from the cross.
we see that the rise of the modern papacy corresponds with the French Revolution. Here's the famous idea that the papacy, which had become this really kind of weak institution by the 18th century, couldn't prevent Catholic kings from, for instance, suppressing the Jesuits. Uh, you get what the famous story I can't remember if it was Napoleon or somebody supposedly says to Cardinal Conzavi, "We will destroy the church," and he says, "You don't have a chance. We priests have been trying for 1800 years and haven't succeeded." But but the point is, it's then Pius VII who becomes suddenly a figure of popularity. And it's
Yeah.
through the sufferings. And then as you go through the 19th century, of course, the modern papacy, and now we're getting a correction to it, maybe a more reasonable way of looking at the papacy within the church. Um, this is absolutely because of the cross and the
Yeah.
loss of the papal states later on, which is then ultimately a good thing, but seemed a terrible thing at the time. And and the
Yeah,
suffering.
I mean, yeah, the 18th and 19th centuries were rough ones on the papists. I mean, in the 19th century, right? You've got early 19th century. You've got the fallout from the French Revolution. You've got the rise of modern science and Darwinism in the middle part of the 19th century. You've got the Enlightenment raging strong in the 19th century, various philosophies attacking Catholicism. And then, of course, you get the Kulturkampf in Germany, kicking Catholics and priests out of Germany left and right. And Italy, of course, then, gets unified and they lose the papal states. Yeah, it was a rough time from a certain
Absolutely.
metric, right?
Right, exactly. But at the same time, also a liberation and a closer conformity to Christ in that way. And
Yeah.
one especially sees that with the loss of the papal states. And Girard, of course, talks about this in his, last big book, battling to the end.
Yes.
How
Well, good. Let's bring it back to Girard.
yeah.
This is good. Okay.
Now, because he talks about, and this is really a critical thing, that the thousand-year fight between church and empire, which is a subject that really fascinates me. So one of the things that makes Europe special is that the church and the empire were never nobody was ever strong enough to solidify power. And in this struggle was a place of freedom. And because there was never this overarching monetary or unitary state that could emerge in Central Europe, there was freedom in other places in Europe for countries to develop on their own. England, Scandinavia, other places, Spain, obviously, because there was no as opposed to say India or China or other places where there was one unitary political structure. And this struggle between the church and empire, took the place that the papacy was also a territorial state. And but the claims were more than that. So you have this mimetic rivalry, these dynastic rivalries. Of course, the papacy is often a plaything of Roman aristocratic families early on because of this, because getting the papacy means getting the land, getting the political power. Um, and and this the high, the high point with the emperor come who has to come and ask for penance because he's I think it's what is it, Boniface the Eighth or something. I could be wrong. I don't know. But the point is, then it begins to change. And
But I know King Henry, one of the Henrys, had to do penance
yeah,
before the
exactly.
Pope.
That's probably it. That's probably what I'm
The
thinking of.
road to Canossa or
Yeah,
whatever
the
it
road to
is.
Spinoza, exactly.
Yeah.
And then of course it begins to change very rapidly in the 16th century because by then the European states have actually learned all the things the church did beforehand well: taxation, finance, accounting, law, courts, parliaments, all of these administrative things the medieval church developed to be a truly European-wide institution. They all did it and got better at it. And then there was the sack of Rome in 1527. The 500th anniversary is coming up in
Yeah.
2 years, which is a most underappreciated historical event because that was the end of a world, the beginning of a new world. The church was now institutionally weak now for centuries. The empire and the political order was now becoming more and more powerful. And Italy itself would be a plaything of dynastic powers and their mimesis for
Yeah.
centuries. So I mean, it's so Girard's really interested in the whole subject, and he says what happens at Vatican I is essentially that the church frees itself from all of this. The papacy declares its universal jurisdiction and it is no longer in competition with anybody because it's existing on a totally different level and it's no longer doing it with a territory. It's now has a spiritual prophetic authority free from this being part of this mimetic dynastic game of Europe.
Yeah. Because it wasn't just the papal states, as you sort of averred here earlier. It's also part of, in a sense, the Pope's possessions was that he, via various concordats between
Right,
Rome
right.
and German city states and Italian city states and France and
Hmm.
England and the the Holy Roman Empire, all these concordats gave the Pope certain real estate privileges, monetary privileges. So in very, very many ways, it wasn't just the papal states. The
No, no.
popes had their financial and political tentacles
Yeah, yeah.
all over the
Right,
European,
right,
especially too with regard to canon law and
right. Absolutely.
regulations of monasteries and things like that.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. This tension on all these levels is absolutely, it's very complicated, but it's very important to know these things because it's so alien to an American mind. We can't
Yeah,
even, but that is, it's all, and it's not an intrinsically evil thing. It just was what it was. And
that's right.
this is how it evolved. And this is really the big creation of Europe. I mean, on a real level, this common vision, this administrative legal reality that translates theology into practices. So you're entirely correct. It was much more than just the papal states, and we know that this is what prompts the reforms of the 16th century, which have already been going on for a century before, to take on a new cast because German princes get behind it. Because now there's a double reason to resent Rome. They're they're plundering us, they're taking our money,
Yeah.
reminding us that they got all civilization from us because they're Roman, and then they got the faith from them. And there was a lot of reasons to resent.
Yeah.
So,
All of it is, it's like a 1,500 year long process of
yes,
unpacking what happened with
yes,
Constantine, where the
yep,
church, you can imagine the bishops are looking around at each other, say in the early fourth century, and saying, oh crap, we won.
right,
Now what do we do? Oh, geez, we're in charge now. Holy cow. Okay, so what do we do we go from Diocletian to Constantine, and
that's
all of a
right,
sudden, oh, geez, we're out of the catacombs, we're in charge. And yeah, it creates a model of church-state relations, a model of how the church is to relate to culture and build
right, of
culture and
course,
infiltrate culture that was extremely terrestrial, let's put it
yes,
that way. Very imminent, very political. And it took a long time, I think, for the church to reach that same point where Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan."
right. No, no, and I mean, think about how bizarre it was at the Council of Nicaea, which was called by a Christian emperor,
Yeah.
not by the Pope. And this was the same empire that had probably mangled some of these men or mangled some of their friends or killed them.
Yeah.
They were under their protection. It must have, and of course, this is not, there's no linear, there's all sorts of episodes in between of ups and downs, but I think the point is it's maybe this is a step that had to be gone through. It should not be something we just sort of say they were terrible because that would be falling into
So
scapegoat.
this is a Girardian point, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And that is also, remember, I mean, even Girard doesn't want to scapegoat the scapegoat mechanism. It had a function to play because it limited violence. The alternative was unlimited violence. But when we know about it, that's what's changed. When we know about it, then we have to change too. And our ancestors didn't know about it. And of course, this is so counterintuitive to human experience that it took many centuries for this to be chipped away at. We are looking at it now because we live in a time of accelerated change, but change came much more slowly, and there were always waves of newcomers coming into Europe, the
Yeah.
Germanic tribes, the Slavs, other groups coming in, and they would have to re-experience these things and have to go through it again. Um, and so I think we should be very merciful with our ancestors. They did as good, well, probably as they could have. If they could have done better, we'll leave that to Jesus to decide, because they
Yeah.
might
I mean, yeah.
think about us.
We don't want to engage in what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery.
Exactly.
And for example, he uses the example, I think, in Mere Christianity, where people look at the ancients and say, "Oh, look, they burned witches. How
Yeah,
stu," and Lewis says, well, they burned witches because they actually believed in witches, and they believed that witches are the equivalent of what would call Satanists today, and that they had real malevolent powers. And so they may have been wrong about that, but one can understand, therefore, the moral motivations. They're not radically different from our own, where
no,
we will engage in mob violence against somebody if they misgender you with bad
right,
pronouns.
for example. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, no, no. I mean, this is the whole point. And Jesus has already drawn attention to this very clearly in the Gospels, and something Girard, of course, references in Matthew 23 when he talks about the scribes and Pharisees painting the tombs of the prophets and, adorning the tombs of the righteous ones and saying, if we had lived in our father's times, we never would have done this. And they're saying it to
Yeah.
Jesus, the very one tomb they're going to do it, or at least be totally consenting. And so this relationship to the past is so important to get right because it's too easy to turn it into a weapon to victimize anew, even if it's the opposite group.
Okay, so for those listening or watching, okay, we're talking about Rene Girard, who famously developed the idea of mimetic desire, where, we learn to desire the things that we desire by, in a sense, looking around. And we start imitating, we start to want what other people want. And so there's this great imitative mimetic quality to our desires, but those desires then run into competition. It's sort of a Hobbesian thing in some ways, right? Where it leads us to a sort of war of all against all for the limited fulfillment of these desires, the resources to fulfill them, and so you end up then identifying a scapegoat. To
Right.
avoid the war of all against all, you identify a scapegoat and you eliminate the scapegoat, which cathartically does this. But now, according to Girard, because of Christ,
Right.
that has been defanged. The whole scapegoat mechanism has been exposed for what it is. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here in terms we're
Exactly.
analyzing church history
Right. Exactly.
in this
Yeah.
same
It
using this
very,
same
yeah.
metric. Yeah.
And it's important always to say that mimetic desire, of course, is operating as soon as we are born. So we are habituated to this in an unconscious way long before we have the use of reason. And then we therefore take it as self-evident that these things are actually my desires. They're not from somebody else. And that the reason can be then suborned into rationalizing this. And we
Yeah.
know that's one of the characteristics of teenagers is hyper-rationalism, that they're good when they want something, they're so good at explaining to themselves, even though there's a 1% chance it's going to happen, that it's going to happen for them. Or the one, that 95% of the time when this happens, you're going to get hurt. And they say, I'm not going to be the one. And this is why it's hard because we need to say it that developmentally this is the case for human beings. It's also the case for groups. And when they find the scapegoat, they're not looking for a scapegoat. They stumble upon it. They cannot possibly know it's a scapegoat, otherwise it won't be. It must always really, absolutely naively and with conviction believe that's the cause of the problem.
There has to be a certain veil of ignorance or a
Absolutely.
naive or a naivete.
Absolutely.
Uh, it,
Otherwise, it
you,
won't work.
it doesn't work because otherwise then you know that what you're doing is
Exactly. It's
wrong. And
calculated.
because you know it's wrong, it's not going to have the same cathartic release
No.
that it would otherwise. You have to believe
How
truly
did it?
that those people that you are scapegoating are truly evil
Right.
and
They
deserve
really,
what they're getting.
they really are responsible. And what Christ takes away is that. And for that reason, Girard says that the scapegoat mechanism is no longer generative. In other words, it used to create culture. It created myth, it created prohibition, it created ritual sacrifice, from which then lots of other cultural artifacts might have emerged. And we can talk about it. He makes lots of claims,
Yeah.
which may or may not be true, but they're really interesting because, and a good theory gives you new eye things to investigate. But the point is now it can't do that. And so, we kind of saw that with COVID because there were the different who was the bad people in COVID, this group, that group, this group. Well, the society never coalesced around any explanation. Everybody was just left in a bad mood.
Well, I could think though of a scapegoat, which was the unvaccinated.
No, I'm saying, but remember, but the unvaccinated were the ones who were going to kill your grandparents. So
Yeah,
so they were bad people, but then on the other side there were other groups. But my point is simply that there were absolute candidates on all sides.
yeah,
Both
yeah.
sides had their listed pot, these are the people, these are the bad people. But the community as a whole never coalesced around one list or the other because we knew we were doing it on some deep level.
So what Gerard is really saying here, it seems to me, is this. Look, Christianity creates this revolution, this intellectual and moral revolution, this spiritual revolution. Took a while, but it generated this in the world. And part of that revolution is precisely the unmasking of the scapegoating mechanism,
Yes.
because Christ is the lamb who was slain, all right, from all eternity.
Right.
He is the the scapegoat to end all scapegoats. But what this creates then in Christian Europe and then in Christian influenced cultures is a great appreciation, morally speaking, for the weak, the vulnerable, the
Absolutely. Yes.
marginalized, and
Yes.
so on.
Yes.
Okay, that's all preamble to what I'm going to say next. What would Girard then have said if I think he did say some things, even though he died before the full brunt of this? What would he then say about a culture that now turns everyone into a victim of some kind? We live in a sort of almost an apotheosis of
Mhm.
victim status. And now we've almost created new scapegoats.
Oh, no, no, there's
And the
absolutely
scapegoat is those who don't recognize the proper marginalized
right.
people.
Right. No, no, this is entirely correct. I mean, and he was already writing about this in I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. And it
Yeah,
was,
exactly. I
yeah,
love that book. That
yeah,
is a
yeah.
great
No, no,
book.
that's the book to start with, the first book to read of his when
Yes.
somebody's new,
I,
because it's a
for
good
those, yeah,
I
I saw Satan. I saw
See
Satan fall
Satan
like
Fall
lightning.
Like Lightning.
Yeah,
And that's he deals with that at the end of the book in chapters really 12 and 13, which for the modern concern of the victim, and then of course the double Nietzschean inheritance. He talks about
yeah,
how with the double Nietzschean inheritance that the Nazis on the one hand trying to break Christianity and its concern for the poor, or broadly understood, another concern for the weak, whatever, um, by a super sacrifice, exterminate the Jews, and then we're free. Then we're beyond good and evil, right? We can do anything. It didn't work. And then the other side is the politically correctness, wokeism, DEI, whatever name it's under at that moment. But this is the out Christian the Christians. Christians say they're for the poor, but look what they've done to them. We really care about the poor. Christians say they're really concerned about children, but priests abuse children. Christians say this, and it would be that. So they try to take the Christian concern for the victim. They try to outmaneuver the Christians, and then they obviously end up victimizing as well. So he would have seen all of this he died in 2015, but none of this would have surprised him. I mean, he had already seen it, and we've seen it also played out that essentially what we have is just the inverting of these hierarchies. Who was once good is now bad. Who was once now bad is good. Isn't there a new Snow White movie like that or
oh
something?
yeah, yeah. Play. Maybe it's a live action play. Uh, and yeah. So a lot of this then speaks in some ways to the a fear that I have, which after having read Girard, is once Christianity exposes the
Mhm.
scapegoating mechanism, and then out of this Christian ethos, there emerges this degraded victimology. Let's
Right,
put
to
it that way.
degrade sacred, yeah.
And so you create this. What happens then in a post-Christian environment where you still have that patina
Mhm.
of victimhood being used as a moral bludgeon,
Mhm.
but nobody now really knows or remembers the source of why it is we have focused on the victim?
Right. No, no. I mean, obviously, then you can lapse back into the old world, well, the old
But my
God.
question though is, can we? Is it now not
Not, yeah, no, no,
worse
it's
than
worse.
before?
And, well, what he would say is absolutely it's worse because the old gods can't save us. In other
Right.
words, the scapegoat mechanism is no longer generative. It is only destructive. It can consume victims, but it will never produce the catharsis. And that's his point. And he believes that's where we get to that critical point now in human history where the human race is free for the first time in a real sense on this issue because the scapegoat mechanism is no longer deluding us. We know what we're doing and we have a choice to make. We either follow Christ more or less in a literal way, especially on these issues, as much as possible, or we're going to annihilate ourselves and destroy the world. Apocalypse. And
Yes.
and that's what both he and Schwager said. When, in the 19th century, the scholars laughed at apocalyptic texts. They're all mythological. No, it turned out that they're an accurate description of what human beings can do. They were just before their time. They didn't have nuclear weapons or plagues like we have that could be generated, or other sorts of perhaps horrible weapons we can kill other people in other ways. But the point is that these things are now literal descriptions of what can happen. They are realistic. They're not myth in any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. They had their fingers on the pulse of the human condition in a way that maybe 19th century German liberals did
Very
not. And
optimistic, but there it is.
yeah. So, okay, so what was Girard's view of salvation? You know, he was, after all, a Catholic. What
Yes.
what
Yep.
what does he think happened on the cross, other than, I mean, a scapegoating thing is taking place, obviously.
So I mean, that's on an anthropological level. Clearly, for Girard, the important thing is the structural symmetry between what happened on Good Friday and other such events that are retold in myth or other literature.
Yeah,
And so for him, uh, what happens by implication is what is important is on the resurrection. That is, at the resurrection, the victim is vindicated, but not only the victim, so is God. Because for too long, human beings have invoked God's name with their violence and have made God at least a complicit with their violence. Accursed is he who hangs on a tree. I mean, they thought they were doing God's work on Good Friday. And by extension, even if Pilate's somewhat reluctant or whatever, the Roman Empire is fundamentally a sacred organization. And it had no problem using violence to maintain its position in the world. And and it was okay. I mean that you because they were serving a greater purpose. So I think that God now becomes radically disassociated from human violence. It has nothing to do with it. This is our work, not his. That truth, of course, is very hard for human beings to accept, even to this day, because
hmm
God is always being blamed for things that are just things that happen. Somebody gets sick, somebody gets cancer, there's a car accident, it's a tragedy, it's horrible. Somehow, some people in faith respond in faith and they accept it, and they're okay with the idea that somehow it was in God's plan. But a lot of other people respond very negatively to that in a pastoral situation where they find it offensive and upsetting. And how could God do this? And I can't believe in a God like that. And I think that's the problem is they haven't yet entered into that mystery of Good Friday where Jesus is there and he gives that cry of dereliction, which is a way of experiencing that God forsakenness, even if at the same time it's also a citation of the psalm, which ends in the praise of God.
Right, Psalm 22.
Exactly. So I would think that since Girard is not a theologian, he's not really engaging questions of how this effectively changes the if this is a
Hey,
sacrifice, accidental sacrifice, it does. But I think that the important thing for him is this revelation of the victim, or the victim is no more guilty for the crisis than anybody else would have been. That's what he means by innocence of the victim. Jesus is unique, obviously. At the same time, the revelation of God's innocence, that God is not a party to our violence.
does Gerard, I know we discussed this a little bit in our last
Right,
conversation, my memories returning. Does he have, I know the early Gerard had troubles with the concept of sacrifice,
right, sure, sure.
you know, but then a later Gerard is going to try and incorporate
Yes,
the fact
absolutely.
that
He does.
Christ's death on the cross is a sacrifice and it's not
Absolutely.
all negative, that
No.
there's a good aspect to it.
And this is thanks to Schwager.
Oh, okay, good.
Schwager's influence on Girard, because of course, for it's not possible to say that Jesus is a scapegoat in the strict theological sense, because Jesus he chose to do
He
this.
gave up his life
He gave
willingly.
up his life intentionally. He did
Yeah.
not, and this is very important because he's not just somebody who ended up there. He knew if he kept doing this, it would lead to this. But the only way to save the human race was to in a sense, make this crisis happen, so that there could be this revelation. And for this is essential part of Schwager's theology about the Hingabe, the offering, that Christ offers himself quite intentionally and offers himself in complete confidence in his Father. And of course we can enter into all the very complicated issues of what did he know in his human sense, divine sense, he's a divine person,
Yeah.
but very complicated. But for Schwager in particular, early Schwager, this was very important that that Jesus is able to do all he does because he's an absolute confidence in God's power, and and for that reason could be free of all other powers. human, sociological, cultural, all the things that he's constantly encountering, because he's navigating a path that's never been navigated in Israel before. He's
Yeah.
freely reinterpreting the tradition in ways that nobody else had done before, bringing prophecies together that nobody had done before, and doing something paradoxical. How can the Messiah be crucified? The Messiah is a glorious king.
Yeah.
I mean,
Here's
as
how.
with Peter's upset, I thought I was joining the winning side when
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
pointed out.
Look, Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now, Lord?
Yeah. And
I
you
mean,
have to say to yourself, is that all you want?
yeah. I
Yeah,
used to tell my students, I used to tell my students, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane where St. Peter pulls out his sword and cuts off
yes,
the ear
yeah,
of the high priest. So I would tell my students, I said, often missed in your meditation or thinking on this scene in the gospel is a very, very simple question. Why is Peter packing heat?
exactly.
Why
Exactly.
does Peter have a sword in the first place?
Yeah,
Look,
yeah,
Lord, there are two swords here. Lurking in the background there in a couple of places in the gospel,
yeah,
it's pretty clear at least some of Jesus' immediate inner circle were armed.
yeah. Well, and
And
Simon the Zealot, I mean, that's even identifies him with a fairly violent group.
yeah, and I'm not saying Jesus condoned that. Obviously, he
No,
didn't.
no, no.
But the
And
point is the level of misunderstanding that they had with what
right, that
still,
he was about.
yeah,
And I think that we still have to strive even harder and harder to get to that part of the proclamation, because of course the gospel itself is a technical term from the Hellenistic world about the coming of the king. It's
yes.
not, it's only good news if you're happy to see the king. Otherwise, it's really bad news that the king is coming.
If the king is coming and is pissed, it's bad
Yeah,
news.
yeah. And that's the vineyard, the parable, the wicked tenants in the vineyard. And he says to them, "What do you think the king will do?" Well, they'll kill him. And he said, that's exactly the point. That's the logic of human violence. And we'll see what happens when you kill the king's son, if he'll come and kill you. And of course he doesn't. They
Yeah.
do they only lose the vineyard if they choose not to accept Jesus. And as is the case of Saul. Saul was somebody who was going after people in the vineyard. He's one of the wicked tenants in a sense, but he converts, he repents, he puts
And
his aside.
okay, so this brings me to the issue of my article, Catholic Road Report, on
Yes,
which is on salvation and the necessity of the church and baptism. And if you go to the com box underneath my article, you'll read certain vicious trad types trashing me for, obviously, I'm a Balthasarian, so obviously I don't believe in hell, which means I don't really believe that the gospel means what it says, and I
I
don't believe.
actually wonder, have any of them read Balthazar's book?
Very few have.
Because of course
They just read trad talking points from,
it's bad
uh,
that they don't. Because
you
the book
know,
really is short. It's not long, and it shows the crux of the problem.
it just lays out the whole
Yeah.
dynamic, and that it's mistitled in English. I
Yes.
mean, the German title is Was dürfen wir hoffen,
Yep.
which means what are we allowed to hope for? What may
Exactly.
we hope for?
Exactly.
Not dare we hope, like he's a
Right.
sort
Right.
of ecclesiastical Don Quixote tilting at the dogmatic windmills of the church.
Uh,
No, it's a Was
no,
dürfen
no,
wir
no, no,
hoffen.
no.
If
That's
you
yeah.
know German, you know the word dürfen has a certain, I can't say it right with the umlauts. I'm terrible with you umlauts. Dürfen. Was dürfen wir hoffen. Yeah, what are we? No, most of them have not read it,
No.
but I also say that even to the ones who have read it, the fact is that book by Balthasar comes fairly late in his theological career, and it's downstream of his major works.
Right.
And I would say that to truly understand, dare we hope that all are saved. And but you have to understand his Trinitarian theology, and you have to
Absolutely.
understand his Christology.
Right.
Means you need to read his Theodrama.
Right. Exactly.
And of course, none of them have read his Theodrama. All they know is there better be a lot of people in hell, otherwise I'm wasting my time being a good person.
Which is true. That I mean, that's a part of the spiritual life. We have to overcome that position. It's a
Yeah, I
normal
mean,
part of the
what I
spiritual.
want to say to them is do not the church fathers and the great Aquinas himself tell us that that's just about the lowest level of Christian discipleship that you can have, which is, I'll follow you, Lord, but begrudgingly, and there better be cookies at the end.
Right,
All
right.
right.
And maybe 72 virgins and raisins.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's
And
things.
those other louts over there, they better go to hell.
Yeah. No, no, I think it is exactly. It's a stage of the spiritual life I think people generally have to pass through. It's not
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah.
It's especially when you're young and you're fighting, and it's hard
Well, it's
and
childlike, right?
it is.
You at first when you're very little, you obey your parents out of fear of punishment.
That's right.
Oh, I don't want to miss supper. Oh, I don't want my mommy to send me to bed, early or something, or take this, ground me or take this privilege away. I don't want those punishments. But then later, what you discover as a child is that you begin to want to avoid parental uh, doing things your parents don't want you to because you don't want parental disapproval
Right. Right.
in a loving sense, not in a punitive
Sure.
sense, but I love my parents, I respect my parents, and
I
I
don't want to
want them
hurt
to,
them.
I don't want to hurt them, and I want them to love and respect
Right.
me.
Exactly.
And so I don't want to do things that I know upset them. That's the next stage in the spiritual life where you move on to saying, I actually love God
Right.
and I love the good, the true, and the beautiful. And
Right.
I want to pursue those things because it reflects better on me. And then ultimately, then you reach this unitive stage
Yeah.
where it's like, I just want to do these things out of the pure love of the true, the good, the beautiful, of the pure love of God.
Yep. Yeah.
So what does so let's bring it back then to the question of salvation, which is the point of my article is that I'm setting up the fact that there is an unsolved theological problem currently in the
Absolutely.
church, right? And that unsolved problem is that in the past, for many, many, many centuries, the church actually did speak in a manner that would leave the impression that it's really, really, really hard for non-Catholics to avoid going to hell.
Even for Catholics.
And even, yeah,
Right.
and which is why many generations, many centuries of Catholics did live in a spiritual milieu of a grossly exaggerated fear of hell.
Yes.
Where, I mean, why they wouldn't go to communion except maybe
Right.
once or delay baptism or something like because they were so terrified that the smallest little sin that they forgot about or forgot to confess is going to send them into eternal conscious torment in hell. The my point is that the church really did have this exaggerated sense of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the
Sure.
church, there is no salvation, which was taken very literally. But
Exactly.
as Pope Benedict points out, in an interview he gave to Father Jacques Sauvé in 2015, he says there has been an evolution of doctrine going on in the church on this issue, and now all of a sudden the church is interpreting extra ecclesiam nulla outside of the church no salvation more expansively,
Right.
and we've expanded the category of the baptism of desire and invincible
Right.
ignorance and I think a greater understanding of the psychology of conversion, the
Absolutely.
psychology of what makes people religious and what makes there's that old-fashioned idea, I preach the gospel to you, you've rejected it, now if you die you're going to go to hell. But that is a very naive understanding of how people come to religious conviction. Go
Especially
ahead.
for those of us who are on the path and not quite sure where we fit in that too.
Yeah,
Because,
exactly.
you say I'm a priest, I'm a theologian, and uh, it's uh, it's not easy. I mean,
Yeah,
and I love it, but it's still not easy. And I mean, prayer, it's not easy. There's all sorts of things we do, and we do it because we know we should do it, and because I think part of the problem is love and emotions are so confusing to us, and we always want love and emotions to be the same thing. And a lot of time, a lot of things in life is doing it because it's love is doing it because it's right, especially for other people, even when there are no emotions coming along that are
oh
enjoyable.
yeah, oh yeah, I
And that is
mean,
certainly the cross. I mean, that's where you see the real cross. I mean, I can't imagine that any part of that was enjoyable to our Lord, but he did it because he loved us and loved us when we were his enemies, as St. Paul says so beautifully in Romans chapter 5, which for me was one of the transformative moments of reading the Bible. To
Romans chapter 5 for you. Oh, okay.
when he said when Paul reiterates that twice, he didn't die for us when we were his friends or we were wonderful, nice people. He died for us when we were not. Then you begin to understand what love is. And then if you begin to understand love that way, then you want that for other people. And then, and of course the doctrines developed in particular historical times and places, and things have changed because our knowledge of the world has changed, not most critically the discovery of the new world.
Yeah.
It's there were millions and millions of people who lived there all these 1,500 years, and they're all going to hell just because they never heard of the gospel.
Yeah.
How did that make any sense?
I mean, it is true. I mean, there were whole
Yeah,
missionary efforts in the history of St. Francis Xavier, who seemed to have, his zeal seems to have come from the apprehension
yeah,
that these people aren't baptized. And since they're
right,
not baptized, they're going to go to hell. So
right,
I better get them baptized,
right,
you know? And my point in the article is okay, that is what a lot of Catholics once thought. It seems as if we no longer think that way. But we're also not universalists. And so
oh,
the question now arises, what the heck is salvation? What is the necessity of the church? If I know, I have a simple question for trads when I talk to them. After, and depending on their answer, I'm either going to keep talking to them or I'm not. If I ask them a question and it's, do you believe that the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived on this planet are in hell or going to hell? Do you believe that? And if they say yes, then I say, well, you and I have so little in common. I really don't have anything more that I want to, because to me, and to bring this back then to Girard, the baseline of the gospel is salvation.
hmm,
They have turned that on its head. The
right,
baseline is damnation.
right,
The exception is
right,
salvation. And then they cherry pick verses from
right.
Jesus about narrow path, wide path in order
Yeah,
to make the point. When I come again, will there be faith on the earth? Yeah, Jesus has a lot of two ways Jewish first century. You talked about what we now know about Second Temple Judaism and its two ways theology, the way
yeah,
of life and the way of death.
yeah,
And people ignore the fact that this is the proposal that Jesus is laying down to his contemporaries. There's the path of death, most of you are on it. There's the path of life, few of you are on it. I am here to give you life. But life is the baseline, not
right.
the exception,
And
really, in the broader picture.
I would add, it's not just a narrow path; it's a path through one person. That's
Yes,
the point.
the
None of us,
narrow path is Christ.
Jesus. He is the narrow path. I can't save myself. He saves me. And whatever my efforts are to manifest my belief in him, they're never going to be enough. He's going to make up for them. And that's not an invitation to moral laxitude, or maybe it
No.
should be, but because sometimes moral rectitude is intolerable for other people.
Oh, I've known a lot of people like that.
Exactly. So no,
They act like they've been sucking on green lemons their entire
exactly.
life.
Gosh, that's what the resurrection looks like. So,
Yeah.
but no, I mean, I think actually somewhere we have to find the joy again. I mean, there should be a joy. We won. He's already won.
Yeah,
Don't
the
worry about
joy, the joy. And how can you have joy if the fundamental message that is being preached to you, here's good news, the God of love has died for your sins. That's the good news. The bad news is if you don't accept that, the God of love is going to come and break your legs. Uh,
right, which has never happened. Which has never happened.
exactly. And
It's
this
never
is
happened.
Gerard's point.
Yeah,
Gerard's point.
yeah,
We wait for the king to
right.
come and kill us because is we have
We killed
disrespected
his
his
son.
son. We've killed
Yeah.
his son. And the king doesn't come and kill
No,
us.
nope.
God is not going to come and break our legs. The church is not a gigantic sacramental protection racket where you, okay, where you pay up and you
Yeah,
do your sacraments or
right.
you're going to
Yeah,
by God there's going to be a recompense to you.
right. The
That's
passport with the right stamps.
Yeah, and obviously I'm being a bit of a hyperbolic caricature here, but not by much. If
No.
I have learned anything over the past 5, 6 years that I've been blogging and podcasting, is I'm continually shocked by the number of, let's call it traditionalist Catholics who think almost they wouldn't put it in those terms, but you unpack it, that's
Right,
how they
right,
think.
right. No. And I think it's really tragic because I can't imagine what the relation, what they're worshiping. And of
What
course,
would Girard say about this?
I think one could say that just as the Bible is a story of I would say, a constant journey from iconography to idolatry to iconography to idolatry, so too is this personal spiritual life. We start out with images of God, our parents, other people, icons, but at some point they're going to become idols because they're not true. God isn't that.
Yeah.
But God is more. And all of these things that started as true representations eventually become false representations. Our entire life is letting go of these things, overcoming these things,
Yeah.
recognizing that we will never see God face to face in this life, but we have enough in Jesus Christ and the saints to see what a true what to constantly demonstrate that this icon has now become an idol and I have to move again. And a constant reference back to
That's right.
him, constant reference back to him, because naturally our representations harden into idols, because there is sin and there is culture and there's all these things and that's what he's trying to break through. So for Girard, of course, this is also working on a cultural level, and when you see that the Old Testament tells the story of the human race making this transition uh, from false images or true images are as far as they go, but they're not. They are really false. And you see this development in the Old Testament of the understanding of God, but then it blows up
Yeah.
in the new with Jesus Christ because it's still beyond anything anybody could have expected.
You know, the
God is so much better than we could have possibly imagined.
gosh, that is so true. We need to constantly remind this is not a denial of God as a just judge and all, or the need for moral regeneration, because theosis,
Yeah,
becoming one with the God of love, demands this moral
right,
regeneration. So God purges us and burns us to bring. But I have a very dear friend who will remain anonymous for now because he's still working on this theory. But he's years and years of scriptural study and exegesis where he has worked out a really interesting system where he points out that the entirety of scripture revelation can in some ways be boiled down to the fact that God blesses us and we rise up. He calls it his end pattern theory. We
right,
rise up, but then I turn it into an idol, like you just
right,
said, and which causes us to fall. You
exactly.
know, the downward slope, we
Right,
fall. And so we're expecting now God's recompense, God's judgment. And God's judgment is simply the fact that he lets us fall.
right, and that's
Yeah, and then but then God's hesed, his merciful love.
exactly
He doesn't kill us. He doesn't punish us. He
no.
brings us back up.
No, and this is exactly Schlager's point as well as Girard that that judgment the, the judgment is the sinner is in the sin. It's not that God's wrath is being visited upon them. This is the consequence of the sin, whether it's one's own or other people's. But it's
Yeah,
not God. This is the divine judgment, therefore, is allowing the sinner to be handed over to the consequences of his or her choices. That's individually,
absolutely.
socially, family, whatever. And it's not God because God's not interested in punishing us. He's interested in saving us. And I think it's important always to remind, that human beings are predestined to salvation. Sin gets in the way of God's plan. It's
Oh
not,
man.
and that's what we have
This
to remember ourselves.
we have to I love what you just said. That God You have to remember God wants to save us. He doesn't want to punish us. He doesn't want to judge us. And yet we have so many Catholics seem to have in their head a vision of the economy of salvation where this world is a little shop of horrors with sinful tripwires that God has put,
Yeah, yeah,
sinful booby
yes,
traps that God
yes,
has put in our
yep,
path everywhere,
yep,
hoping against hope that we all trigger one of those booby traps so we can all go to hell. I mean, obviously, once again, it's a caricature. Nobody explicitly thinks that way, but there is an implied bestial nature in a
yeah.
moral sense to
And
this concept. What a horrible God this would be.
yes, and this you counter this in the problem of scrupulosity all the time.
Well, you're a
People.
priest. You would hear
Yeah,
this in
no, I mean,
confession.
of
Yeah.
course, this is such a cross for people, and you have to tell them Jesus didn't die on the cross so that you would go to hell because, this and the sin you thought you forgot to confess 20 years ago, which you're not confessing. It's okay. It's okay. I
Yeah.
mean, we have rules, and the scholastics helped us with this. We have clarity about distinctions. All of it's good. But at the end of the day, it's a description. It isn't necessary. It's not the reality. I remember reading, somebody gave me one of Don Marmion's books, The Life of the Soul, of the Life of Christ in the Soul, or whatever. And I'm reading it and
Yeah.
thinking, it's talking about this grace and that grace and this grace and that grace. And I said, how does anybody know any of this stuff? I can't continue.
No.
I mean, it's fine.
Oh, yeah.
It's a useful tool to describe something, but it isn't the reality itself. It's a description. It's a tool. It's a conceptualization. It isn't
And
the
those systems are the result of centuries of building upon building upon building upon building, so that you say, okay, there's this kind of grace.
yeah,
Now we know there's also this kind of
right.
grace, and then this kind of grace, and then this kind of grace, and it's all been built up over many centuries. And there's a great beauty in some of it. There, if
Absolutely.
you meditate on it, but
Right.
still, at some point, you step back and say, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. No. There is God in my encounter with the burning bush. There
Right.
is God in my encounter with the living Christ. And to go to confess, I go to weekly confession. So this is not an argument for moral laxity
No,
or
absolutely
no
not.
need. It's an argument against scrupulosity, which
Exactly.
actually then energizes the confessional, unleashes the confessional for the power that it has within it.
Also, scrupulosity ultimately will lead to hatred of God.
Oh,
Because over
yeah.
the long term, how can you live with a tyrant like that? You will,
Yeah.
it will either destroy your humanity or to destroy your relationship with God. You will hate God. And that's the danger. It's almost like one of the best tricks of the devil.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually going right back to the beginning of the garden. Did he really say that?
Yeah. Yeah.
The introduction of the aggravation of the desire and the prohibition, and God is actually your oppressor. I'm here to set you free. So if I can get you to hate God through scrupulosity, I'll set you free. You can do whatever you like. And
Yeah.
it's okay because that's a monster, that guy.
Yeah. And Eve says we're not even allowed to touch it.
Right. But you didn't.
Yeah.
That was an
Yeah.
addition she put in there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all, I think that's all so true. And this is how I'm going to have to read more Schwager now, because I've read Girard, three or
Well,
four books by Girard, but I've never read, what?
interesting because, of course, with von Balthasar and drama, the theodrama,
Oh,
there
yeah.
he's clearly also looks at von Balthasar as an inspiration for his dramatic theology. But
Yeah.
he structured theology in the structure of the drama.
It's interesting. Volume one of Theodrama in Balthasar. I remember when I was doing my doctorate dissertation, I'm reading this thing. I'm reading it in German. Just boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, volume one is where Balthasar lays out all of the basic structural principles of what drama is. And he uses all kinds of different plays and theatrical as examples, and he's teasing out all of these theatrical principles. And I remember thinking when I was doing, dear God in heaven, I can't wait to finish this so I can get on to real theology. And
Yeah.
then I get into volumes two, three, and four, and I'm going, okay, good. We're doing eschatology now. We're doing soteriology now. Let's. But looking back on it now, I need to go back and I have not revisited volume one of Theodrama. David C. Schindler once said to me, that's actually the best volume of the entire Theodrama. And now in talking to you and that's because this is where Balthasar lays out the structural anthropological truths
Mhm.
that cut across time and space in the
Mhm.
human condition.
Mhm.
That would resonate with Girard.
Right. Absolutely. And with Schwager, as he developed that model, that approach to theology, borrowing of many of Girard's ideas, but also the bringing his entire education forward and all because for him the essence of the drama is this encounter. In other words, there's this encounter between Christ and his disciples in the world, and how do people react to Christ? Are they indifferent? Are they interested? Are they completely devoted? Do they hate him?
Yeah.
That's the drama. That this is an ongoing thing that's happening right now, and that's part of the story. It's not just it ends with the Acts of the Apostles or the letters of Paul. That this is an ongoing thing. So, and this gives a big place for the Holy Spirit then to be active in the world. that this ongoing
Yeah.
reality,
Wow.
and that our lives are also meaningful. We're not just like an appendix to the New Testament. That as if that ended and it's sort of done, and we look back to it 2,000 years ago. No, it's happening right now. This is part of the story. This is absolutely fundamental, and for that reason, should fill us
Yeah.
with a lot of enthusiasm
And
and
that meaning, like in any good play, any good theatrical, but the devil's in the details.
yeah.
I mean, the actual character development is not superfluous. Let's get to the theme of the play. Let's not watch the play. Just tell me what the theme is. No,
Right.
it's actually the action, as Balthazar
The
calls it.
action is deep because
So what
that's
I
the
like to tell people, therefore, is look, we're always in this is a good thing in Lent, right? We're always looking into our own lives, trying to find this bigger than life Ariadne's thread that runs through
Mhm.
my whole life that now explains, oh, this explains me. This is my density. This is my dense destiny, right? Okay. And it's always this grandiose thing, bigger than yourself. When in reality, your vocation, the meaning of your life is very concrete in the action. In
Mhm.
other words,
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
vocation isn't to be podcaster extraordinaire, changing the church one brick at a time, one interview at a time. No, my vocation is husband to Carmina,
Hmm.
father to Kelsey,
That's right.
friend of Father Elias Carr,
Hmm.
friend of Rodney Hauser, man who encountered woman at grocery store today and had conversation with. As C.S. Lewis says, you never meet a mere mortal.
Right.
Everything in our lives is incandescent, even though we can't see it. Every person we see is incandescent with spirit, even though we can't see it. And it is those are the concrete, and that's your vocation.
And,
Every single little concrete step is your vocation.
and this is what this measure is exactly what Jesus reveals in the gospel. What you did from the least of my brothers and sisters, you did to me. In other words,
Yes.
and he also says the same thing about children in a different way. And of course, he says the same thing to Saul on the road. In other words, I would say it takes maybe even a greater act of faith to believe that Jesus is in other people than the real presence in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
And both take faith.
Yeah.
Both take faith because I most it people are so difficult, including one, and
Oh,
at least the
yeah.
host minds its own business. It
Yeah.
doesn't. It's quiet and it doesn't do anything to bother you. But
Yeah.
believe that God, Jesus wants us to encounter each other, Him through each other. That that takes a great act of faith. That's more than a mustard seed. Maybe that's the mountain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we've been at this about an hour and almost an hour and a half, so we
Okay.
should probably wrap it up. I could talk to you endlessly.
And I would be
For
happy to do likewise.
we might need to have to do a part three several months from
And I
now.
still want to talk about synodality with you at some point. We don't need to do that today.
Oh, that's true. My other article, well, maybe we'll do a follow-up in a few weeks or whatever you're going to be back in Europe though, but that's okay.
Be
It's
back in Europe, but
what
we
is
have to
it, a
figure out
6 or 7 hour time
maybe
difference? But
6 hours again
6 hours, no big deal.
next week.
I do that all the time. I actually do interviews with people from Australia, and it's like a
That's
12 or
much harder.
13. That's a huge time where
Yeah,
it's tomorrow for them,
exactly.
you know? And so that's no big issue. So I would love to talk synodality with you, but hour and a half, long enough. All right. Thank you, Father Elias
God
Carr.
bless you. Laetare Sunday.
Uh,
Rejoice.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. Bye now.